So I want to talk about a small study that we did at World Fish, looking at the gender dimensions involved with adopting climate-smart aquaculture. So aquaculture as part of agriculture, which is culturing fish species. We looked, it's just a very small window focusing on two smallholder aquaculture innovations that could be considered, that can be considered climate smart and that are, let's say, women appropriate or gender appropriate. And those ones, if you see on that slide, that World Fish is doing under two bilateral projects, one of them being the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia, and the other one, Aquaculture for Income and Nutrition. Both are USAID-funded projects. Yeah, and under those two projects, we tried to use these two innovations. So the study that we did was really trying to understand these two climate-smart agricultural practices, one cage aquaculture and the other one pond polyculture. And we looked at the study across 4 different research sites that are part of the 2 projects I mentioned, which is CISA and AIN. I think, first of all, before getting into what the innovations actually are, it's good to have an understanding of what the actual climate change context. I mean, as Patty mentioned, it's very hard to generalize what climate-smart agricultural practices work because it depends, obviously, on what the climate change impacts and risks are. And so the area focuses in southern Bangladesh, and in general in southern Bangladesh, they're expecting a temperature increase, an increase in seasonal variation, floods, waterlogged soils, and increased salinity. But it's important to know that even across the 4 villages we looked at, risks are very geographically specific, and these need to be taken into account when you design appropriate climate-smart agricultural interventions. So context is important, basically. For this study, we drew on historical climate data as well as modeled climate projections to try to understand for the 4 research sites we chose what the similar and different climate risks are and how that then impacts what innovations you choose. So if you look on this slide, we saw that between now and 2050, the mean annual temperature will increase across all 4 villages, with some villages like the Hatabunia increasing more, so all over 2 degrees. On this slide, you can see, which is the modeled salinity conditions, that some villages will be impacted a lot more by higher salinity than others. So again, Hatabunia seems to be more impacted by salinity, whereas the other 2 villages on the further east side won't be as impacted by salinity. And then on this inundation risk map that's predicting the effect of storm surge and sea level rise, you'll see that some villages, like the middle village there, PC Barukali, they're going to experience a lot more risk of flooding with up to predicted 3 meters of inundation, whereas the more inland communities won't affect that. So, I think it's important to map those out because when you see it like that, you realize that each of the villages have different needs for adapting to climate change and therefore require different kinds of innovations. So to go back to what I initially introduced, there are 2 climate-smart aquaculture innovations that World Fish has been introducing through these 2 projects, which we could consider or are seeing as women-friendly. And I'm saying women, not gender-friendly necessarily there. And so one of those is cage aquaculture, which I think you can see from the pictures what that entails. So it's about culturing fish in a cage, and it benefits women in particular as they do not have to own the resource, and it makes use of underutilized open access water bodies that run beside households in Bangladesh, so that makes access easier for women to access. And so you can see we think that it's a climate-smart agriculture because in terms of adaptation, these cages float, so even if water resources are low or high, the cages can float, so that adapts. And then when you use the cages, you can introduce certain species that help adapt to different salinity conditions, so you can introduce saline-tolerant fish species. And then And so that's how it directly works to adaptation. And then more generally, in terms of enhancing adaptive capacity, this provides a new income opportunity with the potential to benefit women in particular. So that livelihood diversification leads to more resilient livelihoods. And the second aquaculture innovation that I wanted to talk about is called pond polyculture, and it's part of a household system intervention. So there is multiple fish that are introduced in some, for women, especially homestead ponds. And so that's polyculture of carp and or tilapia mixed with small nutrient-rich fish, which are mola. And that's part of the system, as well as high-value vegetables in homestead areas and on dikes. This is adapted to climate change because it combats seasonal variations, because it introduces short-duration, fast-growing species, so people can have livelihood returns in much smaller chunks, and they can harvest more regularly. And again, that enhances adaptive capacity because it is a new livelihood option for women, and therefore leads to more resilient livelihoods. And because of the multiple harvest potential, they can add to their livelihood through as they go on. Both of these aquaculture innovations have been targeted to women through these projects, and I kind of want to talk about right now what that means to target women. And I think one of the underlying understandings of women in a lot of the climate change literature and in climate change practice is understanding women as either vulnerable or virtuous, and that's why it makes sense to target them. So, with these technologies, what I heard a lot is that women are more vulnerable to malnutrition, therefore they need these new innovations. They're more vulnerable to disasters, so they need these new innovations. And that also, there's certain virtues that women have that make them more likely to adapt them. So women are responsible for family nutrient intake. Women are more responsible for home garden management. These innovations accommodate the constraints women have, for example, having to stay in their homesteads. And so these combine the reasons why women are vulnerable and virtue provide the justification for targeting women to get aquaculture innovations. For better or for worse, I think that it's good to also consider what this actually means for adapting to climate change, for improving the lives of women, men, and households, or for gender equality, because I would argue that maybe targeting women and targeting only women isn't necessarily the best way to achieve the development outcomes that we'd like to see and to adapt to climate change. Thanks. And so that sort of set the rationale for the study that we wanted, which is recognizing that, in the whole debate around whether women are virtuous and whether women are vulnerable, in the end, a really important element that we're missing is that we don't understand how virtue and vulnerability is produced. And these are produced by certain configurations of power in a local context that lead to this vulnerability, that lead to constraints that would help people to adapt. And that these are for both women and men, and for the relations between men and women. And we need to really get a handle on this if we want to better design appropriate climate-smart agricultural technologies and implementation strategies. The research question for our little study was, how do gender relations shape the uptake and use of these climate-smart aquaculture innovations? Just quickly to go through the methods, we used qualitative methods because we weren't trying to understand rates of adoption or to quantify the number of people involved in adoption or not, but we wanted to identify the range of factors shaping the use, the how questions, the why questions, and the less tangible and measurable questions around gender relations. So we relied on focus group discussions to help give us an idea of the village context, about local perceptions of climate change and who has those perceptions. These were men and women separate focus group discussions. And then we also had in-depth interviews with men and women in adopting households, so we interviewed them separately. So even though the women were the ones that were targeted for the technology, we talked to one adult man and one adult woman to understand how they use the technology independently or together. And then we also had in-depth interviews with key informants, and you'll see there we ended up with 121 transcripts. And I just want to mention here that the CCAS FAO training guide was very useful in helping to design the study and design the tools. So just to move on to the study findings and to make the point that we're still at the start of reporting on this, and so we've done some analysis, but there's still some things that we're trying to figure out. So our preliminary findings found that there's a lot of gender-related factors affecting innovation, dissemination, and uptake. And one of the biggest ones is how gender shapes the barriers to entry. There are many types of capital required to take up the technologies, and some combination of that is required, and those are quite high, especially for poor households. But then again, even if households do have the capital that they need to take up either fish cages or ponds on their own independently, these sources of capital for entry are often controlled by men. So this makes it extra challenging for the targeted group, which are poor women, to take up technologies without external support. Other factors affecting innovation is that some of the adopters don't feel like they own it or that they have the power to make decisions about it. When the technologies were given out in a group setting, some people felt like there was an unequal or unfair distribution of assistance or inputs, and that led to a tension that affects the potential for group knowledge sharing and learning. There were obstacles for women to attend the training due to their extended family or to traditional gender norms around mobility, and that providing training mostly or only to women can unintentionally shift the responsibility. In terms of how innovations are actually used and by who, it's important, again, to emphasize that even though the innovations are targeted women, in reality, power relations at every level, from the individual to the household to the group or community, and then up to the extra village level, it affects the extent that women actually use and benefit from these technologies. So factors affecting innovation use can be at the extra village level. So how do project officers, for example, how can they better support the independent use by adopters and women adopters? At the inter-household level, what can the group mechanism lead to facilitating the use, or can it often lead to conflict? And depending on the power relations within groups, this can reinforce undesirable gender roles and responsibilities. And then finally, to inter-household relations, which is a big topic that I can't speak about here, that it's important to understand that within the household, even if the technologies are targeted to women, sometimes the innovations are in women's name only, and that this is shaped by the type of work women are perceived to be able to do, and that's shaped by physical barriers, by perceived knowledge barriers, by gender norms, and that there are instances where people attempt to subvert those barriers, and it's interesting to know more about why certain families and households choose to basically abide to different gender norms outside of the norm. My final slides, and that's just to say as the recommendation for the study that at the moment we try to understand how to improve the technology and how to make the technology perfect and to refine the technology, but we need to understand the social context and power relations that constrain how women and men actually use these technologies. And if we do that, that's really going to help us be more realistic about the needs and interests of the target group, and it's going to help us to review our targeting strategies. And that might mean working across scales. It means working with both men and women, and as Patty mentioned, really trying to focus on the iterative learning opportunities to try to improve the way these technologies are implemented and disseminated in ways that are conscious of those power relations.